The moment Nadia Mensah agreed to the plan, she knew it was either the smartest thing she had ever done or the most catastrophic. She just couldn't tell which one yet. Here is what you need to understand before anything else. Nadia was not a reckless person. She was 32 years old, a registered nurse working overnight shifts in the cardiac unit at New York Presbyterian, and the single mother of a 6-year-old named Kofi, who believed with complete sincerity that his mother could solve any problem in the world if you gave her enough information and a quiet moment to think. Nadia had spent the last 6 years doing everything she could to justify that belief. She paid her bills on time. She kept her apartment clean. She showed up for every school event and every doctor's appointment and every 2 a.m. nightmare with the same steady presence. She did not do impulsive things. She did not take unnecessary risks. What she was about to do was walk into the most exclusive private dinner in New York City on the arm of a man she had never met, pretend to be his wife in front of 40 people who would almost certainly be watching for cracks, and somehow hold that performance together for 4 hours without anyone in that room discovering the truth. She had agreed to it for one reason. Not money, though the money was real and significant and would cover Kofi's after-school program for the next 8 months. She had agreed because the person who asked her was her closest friend in the world, a woman named Priya who had been there the night Kofi was born, and the morning his father left, and every hard Tuesday in between. And Priya had called her at 11 in the morning 2 days ago with a voice that said, "This is not a request I would make if there were any other option." Priya's brother Raj worked in private event coordination. One of his clients, a reclusive Korean businessman who valued his privacy with what Priya described as almost aggressive intensity, had been maneuvered by a rival into hosting a dinner that required him to appear married. It was a credibility issue, a business credibility issue, involving a partnership negotiation where the other party had made clear that they did business with family men. The businessman needed a wife for one evening. His own personal life was, as Priya put it with careful vagueness, complicated in ways that made asking anyone in his actual circle impossible. The dinner was Saturday. Today was Thursday. Nadia had 48 hours to learn enough about a man she didn't know to convince 40 sophisticated guests that she had been married to him for 3 years. She almost said no. Then Priya told her the name. Nadia had heard the name before. Not often. Not in the way you heard the names of celebrities or politicians. In the way you heard a name in the margins of conversations at the hospital, said quietly by people who moved in certain parts of the city, with a particular inflection that meant something more than the name itself. Choi Hyun-woo. She had heard that name once from a patient, a man who had come into the cardiac unit late on a Friday night and who, while she was taking his vitals, had said it almost to himself while watching the window, as though he was thinking about something far away. She had not asked what it meant. She was good at knowing when not to ask. She said yes to Priya. And now it was Saturday evening at 7:15, and she was standing in the marble lobby of the Meridian Club on the Upper East Side in a black dress that Priya had selected with the focused determination of someone staging a production. And Nadia was doing what she always did when she was in a situation she wasn't sure she could handle. She was taking stock. She was cataloging what she knew and what she didn't and what she was going to need. She knew his name. She knew he was 44 years old, Korean-born, had lived in New York for 15 years, and ran an organization called Choi Capital that appeared, in its public documentation, to be a private investment firm. She knew from Raj's briefing notes that she was supposed to have met him 7 years ago at a conference in Seoul, where she was presenting a paper on cardiac nursing protocols, which was a plausible fiction, because she had in fact been to Seoul once, 8 years ago, for a nursing conference, though she had not presented any paper. She knew she had been married to him for 3 years. She knew they had no children together, which was the one element of the fiction she had specifically requested, because she was not going to fabricate a child when she had a real one at home with her mother. She knew almost nothing else. She was standing there with her small black evening bag and her carefully selected dress and her almost nothing else when the elevator doors at the far end of the lobby opened and Choi Hyun-woo walked out. She had prepared herself for a lot of things. For someone older, more formal, more obviously intimidating. For someone who would make her feel immediately the full weight of what she had agreed to. She had prepared herself for discomfort, and for the particular kind of focus that uncomfortable situations required. She had not prepared herself for the first 2 seconds of actually seeing him, for the way he moved through the lobby as though the lobby had arranged itself around him rather than the other way around, for the quality of his attention when it found her across the marble floor. He was tall, broad-shouldered in a dark suit that was the most precisely tailored thing she had ever seen in person, with sharp Korean features and a jaw set in an expression she couldn't immediately name. And there were tattoos at his neck. Dark, geometric lines beginning below his jaw and disappearing into his collar, which was the one detail Raj had not mentioned, and which Nadia registered with a slight recalibration of everything she had prepared. He crossed the lobby. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds with eyes that were doing the same thing hers were, she realized, the rapid, complete assessment of a situation. And then he said, in a voice that was quiet and entirely devoid of the performance she had half expected, "You must be Nadia." She said, "You must be Hyunwoo." He looked at her for one more second. Then he said, "They're going to ask how we met." "What did Raj tell you?" "Seoul," she said. 7 years ago. A nursing conference. You were there for a business meeting. We met at the hotel bar." He nodded slightly. "That's close enough to true to hold up if someone who was there asks. I was at a conference in Seoul 7 years ago. Different industry, same hotel district." He paused. "Do you remember the name of the hotel?" She did. She had stayed at the Grand Hyatt Seoul. She said so. He nodded again. "Good." There was nothing performative in it. It was just acknowledgement that the information was useful. She said, "What do I need to know about you that isn't in the briefing notes?" He looked at her. The question seemed to interest him, not in a personal way. In the way that a precise and unexpected question was inherently interesting to a certain kind of person. He said, "I don't drink anything but water and Korean barley tea, which won't be available tonight, so water. I don't touch food at events. I'll eat before. If anyone asks about our home, we live in Tribeca. If anyone asks what you think about my work, you say you stopped asking questions about it 5 years ago and you sleep better for it." She absorbed that last one. She said, "That's the truest sounding fictional detail I've ever heard." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The acknowledgement that a point had been made. He offered her his arm. She took it. His arm was solid and still under her hand, and he walked toward the elevator at the same unhurried, deliberate pace he had crossed the lobby with, and she matched it, and she thought about the next 4 hours and what they were going to require, and she did what she always did. She breathed. She focused. She prepared to be exactly what the situation needed. Stay with me, because Nadia Mensah is about to walk into a room full of people trained to spot a lie, with a man she met 11 minutes ago. And what happens at that dinner table is going to change both of their lives in ways that neither one of them is even close to ready for. The private dining room on the 14th floor of the Meridian Club was the kind of room that cost a great deal of money to look like it had always existed. Dark paneled walls, low amber lighting, a single long table set for 40 with linens and crystal that had the weight of real things. The guests were already assembled, cocktail hour moving toward its conclusion, the low sound of professional conversation filling the space. She felt the room's attention shift when they walked in. Not dramatically, subtly, the way rooms shifted when something they had been waiting for arrived. She was aware of it, and she held her posture and kept her hand steady on his arm and let the shift happen around her. He handled the room the way she had expected from watching him cross the lobby. Not with warmth, exactly, but with a quality of complete presence that was its own kind of authority. He introduced her twice in the first 10 minutes, both times simply as Nadia, my wife, with the specific brevity of a man who did not embellish things he considered established. She handled the conversations. That was her part, she understood quickly. He was comfortable with silence and with the shorter exchanges of business. She was comfortable with people, with the reading of them and the meeting of them where they were. She had spent 6 years working overnight shifts in a cardiac unit, which was training in human connection that no social coaching could replicate. The woman to her left at the table was named Eleanor, a British financier in her 60s with silver hair and a quality of perception that Nadia had clocked from across the room. Eleanor asked her, 20 minutes into the dinner, how long she had known Yunwoo's work well enough to trust it. Nadia said, "I stopped asking questions about it 5 years ago, and I sleep better for it." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "That's either the wisest thing or the most alarming thing a wife has ever said to me at a dinner party, and I find I can't decide which." Nadia said, "That's usually how you know it's true." Eleanor laughed. It was a genuine laugh, short and appreciating. She turned back to her dinner companion, and Nadia was aware, from the slight shift beside her, that Hyunwoo had heard the exchange. She didn't look at him. She picked up her water glass. Under the table, briefly, his hand found hers. Not romantically. Not for the room. For 2 seconds, a quiet, private acknowledgement that she had done exactly the right thing. Then it was gone. She noted that. She filed it carefully. The dinner moved through its courses. She was aware of the performance at all times, the maintenance of it, and she was also aware of something happening alongside the performance that she had not anticipated. The accumulation of small, true things inside the fiction. The fact that when she made a comment about the cardiac implications of a particular kind of business stress, and he went quiet for a moment and then asked a follow-up question that was specific and informed, the conversation that followed was real, not performed. The fact that when a guest at the far end of the table made a remark she found genuinely distasteful, and she said nothing but went slightly still, he changed the subject before she had decided whether to address it, which was something that required either considerable social instincts or enough attention to have noticed her stillness. She noticed that he noticed things. She noticed it in the way that registered below the level of the performance, in the part of her that was always reading rooms and people, and the space between what was said and what was meant. At 10:45, the dinner concluded. The guests dispersed in the gradual way of people who had spent an evening building something and were reluctant to have it end. Hyunwoo handled the departures with the same economy he had brought to the arrivals. She stood beside him and said the right things to the right people, and felt the room wind down around them. Eleanor said goodbye to her last. She took both of Nadia's hands briefly and said, "Your husband is a man people are careful around. But he looks at you the way careful men look at the one thing they've decided not to be careful with. You should know that." Nadia said, "Thank you, Eleanor." Eleanor smiled. She left. The room was nearly empty. The staff was clearing quietly. Hyunwoo was speaking in low Korean with a man she hadn't been introduced to, and she stood near the window looking out at the Upper East Side at nearly 11 at night, and thought about what Eleanor had said, and about the hand under the table, and about the specific conversation about cardiac stress, and about the fact that she needed to get home to her son who was asleep at her mother's apartment, and whose Tuesday school drop-off she had to handle in 36 hours. She thought about all of that in the precise and careful way she thought about things that required precision and care. He came to stand beside her. The room was almost empty now. He said, "You did well." She said, "So did you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The cardiac comment. You were describing something specific." She looked at him. She said, "I work nights in a cardiac unit. I see what certain kinds of lives do to certain kinds of bodies over time." I wasn't performing that comment. He was quiet again. She had the impression of something being considered carefully. He said, "I know." She looked out the window. The city at night, the specific spread of it, the lights going in every direction further than you could see. She said, "I should go. I have a son. He's at my mother's, but I told her I'd be back by midnight." He was still for a moment. She could feel the quality of the stillness, the slight shift in it from what had come before. He said, "You have a son." She said, "Yes, he's 6. His name is Kofi. He wasn't in the briefing notes because I asked for him not to be." He looked at her, not with surprise exactly, with the addition of new information to an existing picture. He said, "Raj knew?" She said, "Raj knew. It was one of my conditions. I wasn't going to pretend a child out of existence. He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, and she was generally good at reading expressions. He said, "How old is he?" She said 6. "He starts first grade in September. He has my mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness, and the clearest sense of fairness I've ever encountered in a human being under 4 feet tall." Something happened in his expression. She watched it happen, and she couldn't name it precisely, but she understood it was real. He said, "Where does your mother live?" She said, "Washington Heights." "Why?" He said, "My car is downstairs. I'll have the driver take you." She looked at him. "We completed the evening. You don't need to." He said, "I know I don't need to." He paused. "I'd like to." She looked at him for a long moment. The room was empty now, except for 2 staff members clearing the far end of the table, working quietly and professionally as though they had been specifically trained to be invisible, which she suspected they had. She said, "All right." In the car, she sat on one side, and he sat on the other, and the city moved past the windows, and she thought about Kofi, who would be asleep in her mother's second bedroom, with his arms out like he was falling in a dream, the way he always slept, and about the drive home and about what she was going to tell Priya tomorrow, and about the fact that she was aware, with a clarity that was slightly inconvenient, that this evening had not been what she expected. He said into the quiet of the car, "What made you agree to this?" She said. Priya asked. He said, "That's not enough of an answer." She looked at him. He was looking forward, at the city through the windshield. She said, "She told me it was important and that there was no one else and that she would owe me one. She's never asked me for anything serious before, so I knew it was serious." He said, "She told you who I was?" She said, "She told me your name." I understood what it meant. He was quiet. She said, "That's not a complaint. I agreed with the information. It was a choice." He turned to look at her. In the car's dark interior, with the city lights moving through the windows and the driver invisible behind the partition, his expression had something in it she hadn't seen at the dinner table, something that hadn't needed to be there at the dinner table. He said, "You understand what it means and you came anyway." She said, "I needed the money, and Priya needed help, and the evening seemed manageable." "Yes." He said, "The evening was more than manageable." She said, "I know." She looked at the city. She said, "You handled the thing at the end of the table." When the man said what he said, he said, "I noticed you." She said, "I know you did. That's what I meant." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You notice things very precisely," she said. "Cardiac nursing. You learn to read what people aren't saying. Vital signs, body language, the things that aren't in the chart. It becomes a habit." He said, "I imagine it does." The car crossed through the park and came out on the west side and moved north through the late-night streets, the city thinning slightly as they moved uptown. The specific geography of Manhattan at night, the neighborhoods changing their character block by block. She said, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "Yes." She said, "The thing I was supposed to say. About stopping asking questions 5 years ago. You gave me that line. It was the truest sounding thing in the whole script. Did you give it to me because it was useful for the performance or because it was actually true?" He looked at her. The quality of his attention in the car's near dark was different from the dinner table. Less maintained, more direct. He said, "Both." She absorbed that. She said, "I thought so." The car stopped in front of her mother's building on 181st Street. She looked at the familiar facade, the lit entrance, the building she had grown up visiting, the place where her son was asleep right now. She gathered her bag. She looked at him. He was looking at her. She said, "Thank you for the car." He said, "Thank you for the evening." She said, "I hope the partnership works out." He said, "It will." He paused. "Can I ask you something?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Next Saturday. There's nothing scheduled. No dinner, No business purpose. Just dinner. Would you come? She looked at him. She was very still for a moment. She said, "That's a different question than the one you asked on Thursday." He said, "Yes, it is." She said, "I have Kofi on Saturdays." He said, "Bring him." She looked at him for a long time. The city was quiet around the car. Her mother's building was lit and familiar and entirely real. Everything inside the car was considerably less easy to categorize. She said, "You don't know anything about 6-year-olds." He said, "No, but I learn quickly." She said, "He asks a lot of questions. He won't understand why he should be polite and not ask them." He said, "Good. I'd rather he ask them." She looked at her mother's building. She thought about Kofi asleep upstairs with his arms out like he was falling, and about the specificity of her actual life, and about the things she knew and the things she didn't, and the considerable space between them. She said, "Saturday at 1. He eats at 1, or he becomes a different child entirely." Something happened in Hyunwoo's expression. She watched it happen. It was quiet, and it was real, and it was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him all evening. He said, "Saturday at 1. She got out of the car. She walked to her mother's building. She did not look back. She heard the car idle for a moment at the curb before pulling away, and she went inside and up the elevator and into her mother's apartment where everything was warm and familiar, and Kofi was asleep in the second bedroom with his arms out like he was falling, exactly as she had known he would be. She stood in the doorway and looked at him for a long moment. His small face in the lamplight from the hallway, the particular piece of a sleeping child who believes completely that the world is safe because the people who love him are present. She thought about Saturday at 1. About a man who had said, "Bring him without hesitation." About the hand under the table that had been there for 2 seconds and then gone. About Eleanor's voice saying he looks at you the way careful men look at the one thing they've decided not to be careful with. She pulled the door mostly closed. She went to the kitchen and sat down and called Priya. Priya answered on the second ring. She said immediately, "How was it?" Nadia said, "You knew. You absolutely knew, and you called me anyway." Priya said, "I called you because you were the right person." Nadia said, "That is not the same as not knowing." Priya said, "No, it isn't." "How was it, Nadia?" Nadia sat in her mother's kitchen at 11:50 and looked at the window and thought about all of it. She said, "It was the strangest evening of my life." Priya said, "And?" Nadia said, "He asked to see me again, with Kofi." Priya was quiet for a moment. "What did you say?" Nadia said, "Saturday at 1. Because Kofi eats at 1. Priya said, "Of course," warmly, in the voice of someone who had known this woman for 15 years and was not surprised. Nadia said, "He's not a simple man." Priya said, "You've never been interested in simple." Nadia said, "Kofi is going to ask him every question he's ever had about anything." Priya said, "Good. Let him." Nadia sat in the quiet kitchen for a while after she hung up. She sat with all of it, the way she sat with difficult things at the end of a long shift, letting the shape of them settle before she decided what to do with them. She thought about what she knew. She knew what his name meant in certain circles of this city. She knew he had given her a line that was both useful and true. She knew he had noticed her stillness and changed the subject and come to stand beside her at the window of an empty room. She knew he had said, "Bring him without hesitation," and she knew that had mattered to her more than she was entirely prepared for. She knew that Saturday at 1 was 4 days away, and that Kofi would wake up in the morning and eat his cereal, and not know that anything had changed. She also knew that for the first time in a very long time, she had said yes to something that had no clear category, that she had walked into a room with a man she didn't know, and come out the other side with something she hadn't been carrying when she went in. She didn't have a name for it yet. She was a precise person, and she didn't name things before she understood them. But she held it carefully, the way you held something that might be fragile or might be the opposite of fragile, and you didn't know yet which, and the not knowing was the whole point. She went to check on Kofi one more time. He had rolled onto his side. One arm was out. The room was warm. She pulled the blanket up slightly. She turned off the hall light. She went to sleep thinking about Saturday, about a man who learned quickly and asked to meet her son, about the specific and complicated and entirely unresolved shape of what came next. It was enough to begin with. It was, for right now, exactly enough. Saturday arrived the way significant days sometimes do, without announcing itself as significant until you were already inside it. Nadia had not told Kofi much. She had said, "A friend is joining us for lunch," and Kofi had said, "What kind of friend?" And she had said, "A new one." And Kofi had considered this with the seriousness he brought to new information and had said, "Okay," and then asked if they were still going to the park afterward. And she had said yes, and he had gone back to his cereal satisfied. She had chosen a restaurant in the West Village that she knew well, a place that was warm and not too loud, and had a children's menu with things on it that Kofi would actually eat, which was a consideration that she suspected Hyunwoo had not factored into any previous restaurant choice in his adult life. She had picked it deliberately. Neutral ground. A place where she knew the layout and the staff and where nothing could feel too unfamiliar. Hyunwoo arrived at 1 exactly. Not 59 minutes. Not 1:01. 1. She noted that. Kofi was already seated and had already eaten most of his bread, and was looking around the restaurant with the alert curiosity of a child who found the world consistently interesting. When Hyunwoo walked through the door, and she saw him in the daylight for the first time, in a dark coat over a simple dark shirt, the tattoos at his neck visible above the collar, she understood something she had only partially understood at the Meridian Club. He was not a man who could make himself look like something other than what he was. He didn't try to. He simply was what he was, completely and without apology. And the question was always whether the world adjusted to that or not. Kofi looked at him when he approached the table. He looked at him with the direct, unself-conscious attention of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned that staring was impolite and who was performing a full assessment. He said, "You have drawings on your neck." Hyunwoo sat down. He said, "Yes. I got them a long time ago." Kofi said, "Did it hurt?" Hyunwoo said, "Yes." Kofi thought about that. He said, "Why did you do it if it hurt?" Hyunwoo said, "Because some things you decide to do even when they're hard." Kofi looked at him for another moment. Then he said, "My mom says that about getting a flu shot." He picked up his bread. "I still don't like it." Nadia pressed her lips together. Hyunwoo looked at Kofi with an expression she had not seen from him before, something that was not managed or precise but was simply, genuinely present. He said, "I don't either." Kofi said, "Really?" He said, "Nobody does. Anyone who says they do is being polite." Kofi considered this with great seriousness, and then nodded as if an important thing had been confirmed. The lunch lasted 2 hours. She had not expected 2 hours. She had thought 90 minutes maybe, a meal and a conversation and a beginning of something that would take considerable time to understand. What happened was something she hadn't planned for, which was Kofi deciding, somewhere around the 40-minute mark, that Hyunwoo was interesting. He asked him about the tattoos again. He asked him if he had been on an airplane and how many, and if he had ever been to space, and accepted no as an honest answer. He asked him if he knew any magic tricks, and Hyunwoo said no, and Kofi said that was okay, but he should probably learn some because they were useful. And Nadia watched a man who made careful men speak carefully sit across from her 6-year-old and give him his full and genuine attention for the better part of 2 hours, without once making it feel like he was managing a child. He asked Kofi what he wanted to be when he grew up. Kofi said, "A scientist or a garbage truck driver, I haven't decided." Hyunwoo said, "Both of those are good choices." Kofi said, "My mom says the same thing." Hyunwoo looked at Nadia, and the look had something in it that she held on to carefully. The specific warmth of two people sharing something true about a third person they had both, in their different ways, already decided about. At the end of the meal, Kofi asked, "Are you going to come to the park with us?" Nadia said, "Kofi." Hyunwoo said, "Is the park nearby?" Kofi said, "It's like 5 minutes. We go every Saturday. There's a good climbing part. My mom doesn't like the high part, but she doesn't say not to go on it because she says I have to learn my own limits. Nadia said, "That is a very detailed report." Hyunwoo looked at her. He said, "I haven't been to a park in a long time." She looked at him. She thought about all the things she knew and all the things she was still learning and the considerable gap between them, and about a Saturday afternoon in November in a West Village park with her son and this man, which was not a picture she had constructed in any previous version of her life. She said, "You're wearing the wrong shoes for a park." He looked down at his shoes. He said, "I can manage." She almost smiled. She held it back for about 1 second and then she didn't. It broke through and she let it. At the park, Kofi went immediately for the climbing structure. Nadia and Hyunwoo stood near the bench she always used, close enough to watch, the November air cold and clear around them. Other parents were there, the usual Saturday afternoon configuration of adults and small children, and the particular patience the combination required. She said, "He's gonna go to the top." He said, "I see that." She said, "I'm going to pretend I don't notice until he's already there, because if I say anything, he'll be more determined." He watched Kofi climbing with the same quality of attention he gave everything. He said, "You know exactly how he works." She said, 6 years. You learn the architecture." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "His father." She said, "Not in the picture. By his own choice, which I stopped being angry about when Kofi was 2 because anger about it wasn't serving anyone. He has my mother and my brother and people who show up for him consistently. That's what counts." He said, "Yes, it is." She looked at him. There was something in the way he said it, a knowing that wasn't performance. She said, "Did you have that? People who showed up consistently?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Not when I was young. Later. People I chose and who chose back. That's a different thing, but it's real." She said, "Yes, it is." Kofi reached the top of the climbing structure and looked down at them and waved with the triumphant expression of a person who had done exactly what he intended. Nadia waved back. Beside her, Hyunwoo raised one hand in acknowledgement, a small, unhurried gesture. Kofi beamed. She watched that small exchange and felt something settle in her chest with the specific quality of something that had been moving for a while and had found a place to rest. She was not a reckless person. She did not name things before she understood them. She had a son who ate at one and had his grandmother's eyes and the most precise sense of fairness she had ever encountered, and she had a job she was good at and a life she had built carefully and with intention. She also had a Saturday afternoon in November with a man she had met pretending to be his wife and who had said, "Bring him without hesitation," and who was standing beside her watching her son climb something high and wave from the top of it, and who had been present for all of it without performance and without asking her to adjust the reality of her life to accommodate him. She had not expected any of that. She had expected a transaction, a professional evening, a story she would tell Priya in specific detail, and then file under unusual experiences. She did not know yet what this was instead. She was a precise person, and she didn't know yet, and that was all right. She had Kofi at the top of a climbing structure in a West Village park on a clear November afternoon, and beside her there was a man who noticed things and who was still here, and there was time to understand the rest of it. There was time. She called up to Kofi. "Come down when you're ready." Kofi called back. "Almost." He was looking out at the park from the top, surveying it with the satisfaction of someone who had earned the view. Beside her, quietly, Hyunwoo said, "He's not afraid of anything." She said, "He's afraid of plenty. He just doesn't let it decide for him." Hyunwoo looked at her. The afternoon light was low and clear and honest, the way November light was, showing everything as it actually was. He said, "Like his mother." She held his gaze. She said, "I'm afraid of plenty too." He said, "I know." He paused. "So am I." Kofi came down the structure at a speed that always made Nadia's cardiac training briefly relevant, landing at the bottom with both feet and turning to look at them with a grin that was all 6 years of him at once. He said, Did you see? She said. I saw. He looked at Hyunwoo. Did you see? Hyunwoo said. I saw. He paused. Good technique on the last section. Kofi looked at him with the expression of someone who had received real information rather than polite praise, which was the only kind he respected. He said, I practiced that part. Then he ran toward the swings. Nadia watched him go. The park moved around them, ordinary and real and full of the specific texture of a Saturday in November in New York City, which was one of the things she had always loved about this city, that you could be standing in something extraordinary, and the world just kept being itself around you, unhurried and indifferent and entirely alive. She said, without looking at him, next Saturday. He said, yes. She said, he's going to want to show you the Science Museum. He's been 5 times and he still finds new things. He said, I've never been. She looked at him. To the Science Museum. He said, I don't tend to go to places like that alone. She said, no, I suppose you don't. He looked at her. She looked at him. The afternoon light sat between them with its particular November honesty, showing everything as it was. She said, 1 o'clock. He eats first. He said, 1 o'clock. And it was enough. It was the right amount of decided and the right amount of still becoming, which was what real things were in her experience. Never entirely one or the other, always both at once. Kofi swung on the swings and called out to them periodically, and the park kept being the park, and Nadia Mensah stood in the November afternoon with her son 30 feet away, and a man beside her who was exactly what he was and nothing he wasn't, and thought that this was how it started. The real version of things. Not in a marble lobby with a performance to maintain. Here, in the cold and the ordinary and the honest light. Here was where it actually began.